Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you in France, in Marseille, and in this event. So thank you very much for your question. It's not an easy question. It's very clear that the consortium model has been, in fact, I will take that differently. If you see at the history of the submarine cable, the first submarine cable was really state action. It was state speaking to state and establishing state relationship. At this moment, the consortium model appears as a way to share the cost, to share the responsibility, and to share the risk on some project which was quite expensive and which involved directly state to states. Okay? What you say is very true. This model is complex. It's costly. It takes a lot of people to make it working. It's not very easy to take a decision in a consortium. And what the kind of new schemes that we are seeing, which appear today with direct investment, are much more simpler and much more efficient. But in the same time, you can see that the consortium model still survives. The DE-CIX, which will be in operation probably next year, it's still a cable which will run on the consortium model. So I do believe that the consortium model will have to improve itself, making more efficient, more simpler, and so on. But in some circumstances, it can continue to survive. Thank you very much. It will help a lot, especially if it's run. Yes? No? Suspense? No. And no? No, still no. Well, it's a little bit like a consortium model. We need to improve it if we want that it survives definitively.
We can all speak at once into it.
It's exactly the same story. Okay. So if we probably survive in some case, but probably you need also very strong improvement.
Anyone else want to talk about the consortium model?
I would just say, and first of all, thanks for having me on the panel. I'm Larry Schwartz from Seaborn Networks. To us, I think I don't know if that works. Is that working? So I would just say that to us, the consortium model is an ever-evolving one, and frankly, I think it sort of depends on how you define consortium. If it's simply a question of having two or more parties sharing the costs of a build of a transoceanic system or regional system, then ultimately, I think that definition holds true. Thank you. That definition holds true even today and will in the foreseeable future.
So it's evolving. It's an evolving process.
Absolutely. So whether you refer to it as a co-build or a consortium, I think fundamentally the number of parties that are involved as a general proposition is being reduced in the sharing of costs. I think seeing a model that has, say, 2 or 3 parties is far more prevalent right now than seeing a large group. That doesn't mean that a large group doesn't work. But I think the trend certainly is to reduce the number of parties involved. And frankly, the number of parties actually looking for fiber repair ownership on any given route at a particular time may arguably be reduced at this point as well, depending on what route you're referring to.
Andrew.
Hi there, Andrew McGrath from Vodafone. And just to add to that, I think really the model that will be chosen for each cable investment is essentially the simplest possible that will work. The consortium model is tried and tested over decades and has worked, but it is cumbersome, slow-moving, and so if you can adopt a simpler model, then that's got to be the answer. And I think on some routes, like across the Atlantic, that have many advantages in that they're liberal regulatory environments at both sides. They're very high demand in terms of capacity, and it can be that one large player can just simply go ahead on their own. But not all routes are like that, and so you have, whatever is the simplest practical model between consortia on the one hand, one player on the other, but generally some sort of hybrid in between.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Just ask me.
Just to complement what my colleagues said, Definitely, we see a shift in terms of paradigm. More and more private initiatives in the submarine space has been, let me say, seen in the last few years. I would like to share some numbers which I think helps to quantify this, let me say, this paradigm shift. Although on the background, I would comment that we don't expect consortium to disappear. Probably the model will slightly change, and there are some specific drivers where the geography definitely makes the difference, and there are a number of countries who have a need to access to the internet and the cloud engine, which drives the fact that they get into this consortium or this club. But the figures I want to share are about the percentage of, let me say, capex allocated between 2014 and 2018 in cable builds were 66% done by consortium, 26% by private investors, and 8% by development banks. So in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years. Before that, private and development banks were only 1 digit, so 80–90% were in the space of consortium. What we see from this analysis projected in the next 3 years, see 47% in terms of investment run by consortium, 44% by private initiatives, and 9% by development banks. So we clearly see an increase in investment from the private sector.
Great. Well, let me ask you to follow up on that. Over time, do you think that we have evolved from consortium cables to private cables with a reduced number of sophisticated, large capacity intensive parties, including, of course, our friend Ricardo, OTTs? And do you see like ownership at the fiber pair level? Do you see risk sharing, O&M sharing? And what do you think has been the predicate for this evolution? No, actually, would you mind taking that?
I take on that? Okay. So as an internet exchange operator, it's a bit hard to answer no details about this, but I want to comment how we're involved in that. So, funny enough, all of the colleagues on the stage are partners, or the organizations behind the colleagues on the stage are partners and valid customers of DE-CIX, which shows one simple fact, that sea cable investments and sea cable infrastructure, they drive interconnection to a very high degree. So all important hubs today where we do see a high density of sea cable landings, they're at the same time, or almost at the same time, very active interconnection hubs and hubs for telecoms business. Look at Marseille. That's a very good justification for what can happen if a lot of sea cables do land. And what we do see as DE-CIX, to comment this from the Internet Exchange and interconnection platform perspective, we believe that this will even happen more in the future. We will see, based on sea cable investments and infrastructure investments, we'll see a creation of new hubs, a creation of new regime how traffic will flow. Let's get a couple of examples. The south part of the Atlantic is extremely attractive. It's getting more and more attractive because of new technology, new investments, new parties investing in sea cables between Latin America, Africa, and the south of Europe, between North America and landing in the south of Europe. And this shows us that the telecoms industry and the investors behind sea cable infrastructure, they do look after the lowest latency possible, creating new hubs for interconnection closer to the users of today and especially the users of tomorrow. Lisbon will play an important role, and Marseille does play already an important role. Madrid will play an important role. Madrid doesn't have a sea access. Doesn't matter.
So can I just interject for a second? So do you think those cables, particularly in the South Atlantic, these new cables, these new geographies are encouraged by the new partnership model? I mean, do you think that?
Absolutely. We do see partnerships based on different business models. The old telco operators, they have been investing in sea cables for many, many, many decades. But now we see companies which are focused more on the outbound side, like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and co. And we see they invest heavily in sea cable infrastructure because they do treat sea cable infrastructure not as a product. They treat sea cable infrastructure as infrastructure enabling their core products to being delivered to the users. And one last remark on Madrid, when I said it doesn't matter. Madrid will become or will grow as a hub even not having access to the sea directly, because this is what I see as a very important trend, that sea cables are not under the water anymore. They try to be on the ground or under the ground as well. So we see a huge trend of extending the sea cable landing to specific hubs with terrestrial extensions, which creates a completely different dimension, where the landing of a sea cable happens directly in the data center where telecommunications business happens. So there's a very, very interesting trends which are important for the business of all customers using the sea cable, because then the costs of landing and the costs of doing business, they can be dramatically reduced in this case.
So it's really eliminating silos between submarine cable, data centers, metro fiber, terrestrial fiber, and the like. Giuseppe, you're involved in almost every aspect of this, private, non-private consortium. Is that your view? Is that where you think things are heading?
Yes, absolutely. The interconnection is the key point. We have seen in the last few years, at the end, cable lands in a landing station. This concept is changing dramatically in some geographies, is not changing or is not changing enough dramatically in other geographies. So in the mature markets where the competition is present for many years, where the competitive dynamics is evident, this is what we have been seeing, especially in the coast of the US, in Europe, where the interconnection happens more and more close to the shore, and there are new initiatives with ecosystem which are located more and more close to where the cable lands, because the architecture, because of, let me say, a number of resiliency-related aspects, but because at the end, the smoother is the way the connectivity, which is brought, intercontinental, cross-regionals are exchanged, interconnected, not only between carriers, which was the traditional paradigm, but at this point, directly with content and cloud platforms makes a difference. If I can bring the experience of Sparkle, we have embraced this paradigm when, for example, being part of a large consortium system, CV5, we opened up what used to be the Palermo landing station in an open environment. We created Sicily Hub, we hosted DE-CIX, other internet exchanges, our competitors, so we made a double effort on our side as a carrier to really create what is one of the 3 pop locations of this consortium system, which has a number 18 cable landing stations along the path, which are ruled in a different way from the ending points, which are Palermo, Marseille, and Singapore, where the ecosystem are localized there, and there is a full, let me say, easy way, extremely competitive and cheap way to interconnect to third-party networks.
Jean-Luc?
Yeah. If I may say so, I think that there are 2 different things. There is a big trend, which is really important, which is the fact that we live in a world which is more and more open. And the key word is openness. Okay? And in this sense, I think that when you say that we break the silo between data center, carrier, transmission, and so on, this is effectively the fact. After that, if we speak about technology and different kind of technical solution, is a little bit like the model on which cable will be built, consortium or not consortium. Which is important today is to have the flexibility and to have a large range of solutions, and we can choose for each project the most suitable solution, the most in order to leverage this word of openness. But the key word really is a capacity to take the opportunity of this huge bunch of traffic, this huge bunch of content that carry a submarine cable, to share it with the maximum number of people, and as possible of the users.
Great. Well, Ricardo, we haven't forgot about you. I know you're partner to many and friend to all at Facebook. So my question to you is, we're seeing an increased investment and level of interest from OTTs and social media companies and submarine cable networks, sometime with traditional chain carriers involved. Is this the optimal success model, or are we mixing apples and oranges? And is this a prevailing paradigm going forward? You know, where do you think Facebook, Google, Microsoft are heading over the next few years in terms of paradigms, models for submarine cables? And what's Facebook's role?
Okay, so I would say, as our partners have mentioned before, and I'm very happy hearing our friends talking about open cables, about working together in an open way, building flexible, dynamic solutions. This is something that we have been looking for the last decade, and we are glad that the market is evolving into that direction. But as everybody has pointed before, there is not a unique model. You know, if you look at different geographies, different traffic demands, there might be different solutions that might be applicable, and it doesn't mean that we have to generalize and be religious that, okay, this is the model in the future, private cables, consortium cables, partnerships. I believe it will depend at the point of time where needs appear, what is the appetite, the need of the market, and then we will just try to figure out what is the best way for that particular region at that particular time point. Our preference is work with partners, with carriers in an open, transparent way. We see ourselves as peers of them. I believe there's been a huge evolution since I joined Facebook 5 years ago. I remember we were still running on 10G leases. And now we are one of the most active subsea cable investors in just 5 years. Reason behind that is the huge traffic demand that has driven us to play a significant role in development of submarine cables. I believe if you compare historically, traditional consortia were, as Jean-Luc has mentioned, state by state or just the old incumbents, because there was a need of communicate countries by countries. Even the concept of wholesale market was not in place at that time. Probably when the first private cable started, they will develop the concept of wholesale, of selling capacity to the incipient ISPs in the early 2000s, because the data communication needs was going to come. 20 years later, we are still debating about consortium private cables, but probably one of the main changes is that there are companies like us, like other OTTs, that we have a significant demand of traffic. And that's different from 20 years ago, where voice was not really needing a lot of capacity, and private cables were just betting on a lot of future applications, but it was not clear who the buyers of that capacity might be. But when you have a handful of companies that have a significant demand, it is reasonable to understand that they would like to play a role in the way that systems are designed, because it becomes a critical infrastructure for their core business. It's not part of their core business, but without that critical infrastructure, they cannot develop their business. Said that, our position at Facebook is, and the preference is, develop partnerships with the carriers, with other OTTs, work together, analyze, okay, what is the demand of a particular market. Of course, in the transatlantic, it's easier. There is a huge demand, and only a very short list of companies that might have needs for capacity or might have appetites to develop a wholesale business in that route. If we look at developing geographies, developing markets, there are two different approaches. One is, well, I have enough resources on board to build something that will serve myself, and I take the risk of adding incremental capacity, fibers in the system, with the hope that others might come later. Or you take your time, sit down with the carriers of the region, with other OTTs, and try to define, okay, what would be the demand for that region look like within the next 10 years? Can we really work together defining a model, a design that works for everybody? I believe those two approaches are valid. I'm not saying one or the other is better. Our preference is the second one, just taking the time and work with partners.
Well, let me ask you a pointed question then, Ricardo. With some of the OTTs announcing true private cables with no other carriers, say, for example, Google's Curry system, do you think that cable is an anomaly, a one-off situation, or do you think it's going to impact more and more models going forward for some social media companies?
As I mentioned before, this is a valid strategy. They might have their good reasons for walking that path. They've announced 3 of such cables, and well, at the time those cables get built and are in service, we will just identify if it was a good approach or not. One of the key elements that for us are important when you design is as well talk to the carriers, look what is the underlying demand, what are the investments that those carriers have made in recent systems, and see if we can work together serving everybody's needs, transitioning to an open model, but without disrupting the existing market in a short period of time. Because you have to take into account that those carriers might have made huge investments in the region. Some of those consortia cables have been built at the peak. So if you look at the cost per terabit or the capex of the investment is huge. And still there is capacity in those systems that can be upgraded. So you are asking carriers, hey, you have to throw away your investment, you have to join us and forget this, or can we work together? Because building a system in the developing region might take 3, 4, 5 years. It's really challenging. You have permitting is always on the critical path. So again, I believe that you have to take everything into consideration before you make such a decision.
Thank you. So let me ask some of the carriers on the panel. I know some of you, look at social media companies as customers, as competitors. 1 or 2 of you have described them as frenemies, which I guess is a perfect adjective on a partnership panel. How do the carriers view, the evolution of social media companies in our space? Andrew?
We just hate them. No, I think it's a complex story in that it depends which part of a carrier you look at. And it's certainly true that in some areas we'll compete, some will cooperate. In the carrier market, I think we're all used to working with other players in the industry. I mean, the sort of complex relationship that we might have with OTTs is not it's often bigger, but it's not dissimilar to the complex relationship that we have with other carriers. We compete in some markets fiercely, and in other areas we'll cooperate. So I think in this part of the industry we are experienced at doing that, and we have Chinese walls between the wholesale environment and the retail environment. And I think there's a great pragmatism in wholesale. It's about achieving the best economics to support your business, and you're opportunistic and agile in the way that you adapt your economic models to achieve that. As Ricardo says, the market has evolved enormously in his time at Facebook. In 5 years ago, or 6 years ago now, we set up Vodafone Carrier Services. At that time, Vodafone was the largest user of bandwidth across the Atlantic. It was with this sort of 100 years or so of history of that organization, we'd evolved to a certain level that was the biggest in the market at the time. In those last 5 years, it has completely transformed, so that our requirements, the largest of any of the traditional carriers, is pretty much a rounding error compared to these new guys on the block. So we've had to adapt the models to that, and I think we've adapted successfully. So for us, partnership model is really key. We contribute what we can to those partnerships to accelerate the evolution of the market. So we contribute cable landing stations, licenses, backhaul capabilities, and pull our smaller demand into the subsea cables. But we contribute what we can to accelerate it, because the improved economics benefit the rest of our organisation, and there's no doubt it will continue to evolve going forwards as well.
So a high tide raises all cables. Larry.
A couple of things. One, I would certainly agree that, I think there's a lot of attention paid to the OTT greater involvement in new build systems, but the reality is the relationship that many of us have with them is no different than the relationship that we have with each other. I mean, just looking at our Seagrass 1 cable US to Brazil, Sparkle is an incredibly important customer for us on the Seagrass cable, and at the same time, of course, we at certain times are competing against Sparkle for some of the same opportunities traveling on the route. That should be no surprise to anyone. I think that's the nature of the industry. But the one thing I wanted to touch on is that the growth of the involvement of OTTs in new build systems, to me, seems to coincide with the greater involvement of a handful of entrepreneurial cable owners like ourselves, like Aquacoms, like Hawaii, that I think have also been playing an interesting and greater role in a lot of these systems certainly over the past 5 years or so. The concept of private cables, say late 90s, early 2000s, was largely, you would think of sort of Global Crossing in that era and, selling in the wholesale market. And now I think the entrepreneurial cable owners, such as ourselves, are ones where, admittedly, when we're involved in a new build cable, we have no internal demand, right? What we are looking to do in this role, or in a role that is tied to an OTT new build, what we're looking to do is be the aggregator of the smaller demand that a wide range of carriers and others have on the route. And so I think it's an interesting dynamic that has grown up with some credibility compared to looking back to when we first launched our system. So you look back to sort of 2012 and before, and I think there was a sort of a trail littered with sort of failed entrepreneurial efforts. And I think now at this point there are a handful of them that are legitimate players in the industry. Admittedly we're a lot smaller. We are more entrepreneurial, but I think there's a place in the ecosystem for the kinds of roles we play on certain routes.
No question.
Yes. Each time this mic arrives to me, it stops to work. I must have a problem with him. So, Andrew, frankly speaking...
That's the problem with consortium sharing.
I think it's a waste of time to try to see if we are competitor, if we are partnership, or whatever. Frankly speaking, I didn't spend 1 second of my time to try to resolve this kind of question. We are all in the same bottle. Huh? We are in the same ecosystem, and which is important is to be very agile in this ecosystem. And if we try to come back to this question of competitor, partnership, and so on, it's not something which is fixed. It can even change on certain circumstances, on certain market. We can be competitor on one side, we can be partner on another. Which is really important is to be able to be extremely agile, extremely quick to analyze the situation, to see the right partner, and to try to build something together. This is really key. Nobody, even a big OTT, has in his hand today all the elements that you need to build a complete solution, including local network, including content, including backhaul, including service, and so on. So the success of our industry is really a question of ecosystem and success of everybody. And for me, it's very clear that in the industry, we will succeed all together or nobody will succeed.
So let me turn, oh, go ahead, Giuseppe.
Provide also, I would say that on the, let's say, on the relationship between carriers and OTT. On one side, carriers, I would say geography really makes the difference. So in some geography, on some routes, if you talk about the submarine cable infrastructure and assets, clearly the carriers are suffering the fact that they are disintermediated from the traditional need of connectivity and capacity. If you look at the transatlantic routes, today 80% of the capacity is owned by OTTs. I think no carriers really see a business there to sell to OTTs connectivity. I can say that on other geographies we still have a pretty fruitful relationship in terms of providing them with connectivity solutions, and of course they will start building on some of these routes, but I agree at the end that there will be complementarity between the positioning. As Ivo clearly said, what the OTTs, who are major investors, are doing on the submarine is not a product, so they are using it as an enabling factor, and their driver has been so far mainly interconnecting their hyperscale nodes and data center, which requires multiple fiber native needs. When you start needing multiple fiber between different geographies, of course you have the let me say, the scale to phase a project either by yourself or with a very small club. At that point, having access to, let me say, a very, let me say, interesting unit cost. In this picture, the carriers still are, let me say, capable to provide the skills in the operations, in the landing, in the licensing side. So there is space for cooperation in this changing picture.
Great. So let me honor the Slido group. I've moderated a few panels recently at Capacity, and I can always count on our friend Anonymous to ask a question or two. I think some of the latter ones we've touched on, but let me start with the first. And if I can ask Ivo if you would take that, and which trend do you think will prevail? Do we think interconnection hubs will move to CLS locations, or alternatively will terrestrial extensions be used to enhance existing hubs?
Yeah, thank you, Anonymous, for this very open question. And I think the question is very open because there is no right answer to this question. I think both answers are correct. Of course, we do see a huge trend for creating new hubs and ecosystems along sea cable landing. Marseille, great example. More to come. We do see Lisbon somewhere there in this scenario. We do see established hubs based on sea cable landings. We don't have to forget the well-established hubs today with worldwide importance, like Tokyo. We do see Singapore, Hong Kong, East Coast of the United States, West Coast of the United States, South America. So we do have a lot of Europe, London, Amsterdam. Of course, these are huge hubs based on sea cable capacity somehow as well. And Mumbai, not to forget, in India, of course. But we will see also another trend. So yes, first to be very precise, interconnection hubs will be created along sea cable landings. This will happen. This happened in the past and will happen in the future. And we have already proven track record with new hubs, slightly new hubs like Marseille. But also the second trend we see happens already because of the improvement on efficiency of terrestrial infrastructure and the costs in terrestrial infrastructure. We see that the sea cables, they start learning how to walk on the ground. And this will lead to a further impact on existing terrestrial hubs. And I gave early the example of Madrid. Madrid will be part of this development of new hubs in the south based on the concentration of sea cable landings in Marseille towards Middle East, Asia, and east coast of Africa, and Lisbon, or I would say the west coast of Iberian Peninsula, important for Latin America and west coast and of Africa and South Africa. So both is very true. And one more trend here, we do see that sea cable investments with some also terrestrial loops, they already started to change the importance of existing hubs to some specific regions. Like take the example of Miami and Latin America, where we do see a huge trend towards New York now for Latin American networks based on investments like Seaborn did and does. A lot of South American networks, they look at New York today as their prime interconnection hub instead of Miami. I'm not saying Miami will disappear, it's a great location. Not because of the weather only, but we'll see new gravity which will be developed in new regions for target groups they're looking into because of new trends on the sea cable side.
I obviously agree with all of that. I think fundamentally you'll see an increase in both, and fundamentally what we're hearing, I think, from the whole panel is you're going to see simply an increase in the number of hubs. And so looking at South America, for example, in the case of Fortaleza, it wasn't that long ago that Fortaleza was not actually a hub. It was simply a landing point out of necessity due to the network architecture that existed at the time. So by the time we ended up building the Seabrass cable, we could build over 10,000 clicks without having a need for interim landings along the route, like the older generations were required to have. But since those older generations of cables had landed in Fortaleza, that combined with the geographic proximity to the western coast of Africa, to Portugal, makes it a logical launching off point for those locations. And so now you see something of a hub created there. You see data centers being built there, et cetera. And I think certainly you see it in Virginia Beach.
Just to say Virginia Beach.
Virginia Beach is very much creating its own ecosystem, both at an entrepreneurial level with data center players, as well as some of the larger players, as well as areas around it, whether that's Richmond and not limited to Ashburn even, right? It's not everyone just trying to get to Ashburn. And so I think what I would say is you're certainly seeing an increase in both landing stations becoming hub locations, and you're seeing also the movement further inland as well. But all of that is simply due to the trend of needing more hubs.
Probably no better example than Marseille.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Giuseppe, let me start with you and for the last question and go right down the panel. I mean, the reason you're on this panel, all of you, is you're great predictors of the future, great visionaries, being able to see around the corner. But as the submarine cable industry has evolved over your long careers, what's been the single one factor that you, in retrospect, find the most surprising and unpredictable?
But I would say that what really has been difficult to match has been the expectation on submarine cable business cases and the reality. Sparkle has been engaged in submarine cable builds almost by a century. Its predecessor, Italcable, built the first cable in 1925 connecting Argentina to Italy. I haven't personally seen that business case, of course. I've seen the last, the business cases of the last 15 years. And on that we have seen results which were much better than expected. And in some cases, which we have to put that in account, results which were much worse than expected. So overall, I think it's difficult in this infrastructure business to identify exactly what will be the result of your entrepreneur initiative. Although again, if you have an overall vision and we have a large set of investment that provides this, you can be successful.
Great. Jean-Luc, you've been around for a long time. What's the most surprising factor to you?
Everything is surprising in this industry. It's a very open industry. If you look like a little bit in the past, everybody knows in this room that the first submarine cable was built in 1851. It starts from France to UK. When you look at the history of the submarine cable, this technology nearly disappeared 2 times in this history. In 1920, there was a lot of submarine cable, more than today. There were 64 submarine cables at this time in France, but 3 years later, the industry completely bankrupt and was very near to disappear. So, and it's a general trend. We never have to believe that something is established forever. Everything can happen, even in our industry. Today, submarine cables are really the king of the transmission for a long distance. Well, let's see what happens tomorrow.
Right, Larry, you made some great investments when the industry was down, and it's come back up. You've seen it fluctuate. What's been most surprising to you?
I think the biggest challenge is, whether it's terrestrial or subsea, you're talking about planning and building and running systems that have long lives of decades. And yet the ability to actually think that we can forecast beyond, say, a 2 or 3 year window is incredibly difficult. In 1994, no one would have been most of us would not have been able to predict what 1999 was going to look like. And in early 1999, most people were not able to predict what the .com and telecom crash was going to look like. And then, years ago when we bought Global Marine, the cable ship business, before Seabourn, I think most people thought we would not be installing a new transoceanic system ever with that investment. And so the one thing that remains the same is the amount of change. It's dramatic. It is unpredictable. I think right now there's always a knee-jerk reaction to sort of feel like the status quo will remain the same for the foreseeable future. But even as Ricardo pointed out, just when he first joined Facebook, which was about the time that we launched Seabourn, OTT involvement in new build cables was almost non-existent. I think the only one at the time was the Unity cable that Google was involved in. And now we, of course, recognize the huge role that they play here. So to me, the constant change and the challenges associated with trying to plan for a 2-decade-plus investment while recognizing the unpredictability of the industry is the biggest challenge.
You're right. In fact, I remember in 1999, what was keeping my clients awake was the Y2K bug. So very quickly, Ida, what's the most surprising factor to you?
I think the speed of how ecosystems will evolve and will change and will develop further. What do I have in mind? We do see a huge demand for different type of interconnection services today. Just a couple of years back it was only peering at our end. Today we see a variety of different requests for interconnection services. When we started working for providing services even for enterprises through partners, how they can connect, this is one very surprising thing. We thought because of digital transformation and digitalization of the entire industry, this will happen somewhen. But that this will happen so fast, this is kind of a surprising thing. And facts are already in place. So, for instance, Porsche connected already in the exchange in Frankfurt. We have different requests from huge enterprises to connect directly to interconnection infrastructure. So, I think the day is not far away where we'll see new investors in sea cables, companies like Boeing or General Electric. They might show up as well.
Great. Andrew, you touched on it. What do you find most surprising?
Without doubt, for me, there's speed of change. So the demand from the OTTs. 10 years ago, I would have been wrong by a huge amount if I'd anticipated the demand that the OTTs would have had. So that speed of change over the last 10 years, And then immediately to contradict myself on the speed of change, if we'd had this panel 10 years ago, we would have probably had a panel of middle-aged men, and we still have a panel of middle-aged men, so probably we need a little bit more change pretty quickly. So.
All right, so Ricardo, did you ever think that Facebook would expand beyond connecting Harvard University underclassmen?
Well, I believe that the biggest change for me, with all respect to the subsea industry, is mobile. When I was at university, fiber optic was a new thing, and okay, there were some analog mobile telephones. Right now, the speed of mobile evolution, 3G, 4G, 5G, has changed dramatically the landscape. We went from a broadcaster model with satellite. Now we have billions of individual content generators that will generate a massive amount of data, and that data needs to be transmitted elsewhere. And the only way we can transmit data in an efficient way between continents is with submarine cables. So I believe that there's a lot of new change coming, new demands, other applications that will really demand that kind of technology. And if you look at even the evolution of submarine cables, we all were thinking, okay, there is a standard limit, we cannot go beyond 8 fiber pairs. Now systems above 8 fiber pairs, 12, 16 fiber pairs are being built. Manufacturers are talking about 24 fiber pair systems. They will just generate new markets, like enabling in certain markets like transatlantic a transition from a carrier's lead wavelength service to, why not, a dark fiber wholesale market service. But as well is like what I call the theory of the hard drive. My first laptop had 48K. The first serious computer I had 32 megabyte hard drive. Now you don't get less than 1 terabyte in a laptop that costs a few $100s. And as big as your hard drive is, you get it filled up immediately. So I believe that that might happen with subsea cables.
All right, Jean-Luc, one final word.
Just a private word for Ricardo. When you rebuild a submarine cable for a few $100s, please place me a call.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll be very interested in.
Okay, excellent. Two final housekeeping comments. I think we're pretty much out of time. We have one more question? I'm sorry? Okay, why don't we do one more Slido question, but very, very quickly. Why don't we go with the top one? Because I think,
one word, TAT14.
TAT14. Okay. So will the OTTs dictate the future of the industry? Of course, remember the antitrust warning earlier? So without, the industry would go bust again.
Well, I believe that we are not dictating the future of the industry, because where we are seeing our demand is where carriers see as well their demand. So there is a tight combination between mobile network operators, international capacity demand. So it's not that there is one company dictating rules. It's just defining the right partnership among the different players in the industry, because at the end we have an ecosystem where everybody is looking to a more cost-efficient way of communicating.
Also, I would add, look, even over the 3 years of this conference, the role of the OTTs has changed in, the EU, the US, the FTC, the DOJ investigation. 3 years from now, OTTs may be very different animals, for better or worse. Anyone else want to make a quick comment on that? Okay, just in terms of, are all OTT lead cable projects the same in terms of partner structure? I think the consensus is probably no to that. Does anyone disagree? And finally, are rising sea levels due to climate change and the subsequent impact on coastal infrastructure behind the recent thinking of bringing landing stations inland, or there are more business issues to that? Ivo, do you want to quickly comment on that?
Well, that's not very close to what we do. I think other colleagues will be better to answer this question. My thought on this is, again, I think the current infrastructure is well protected. Of course, there is impact based on climate change, but as far as I'm aware of, not a huge one on the landing stations. But if someone has a different opinion,
So you don't expect the waves to hit Madrid?
not at all. They will hit the wave of telecommunications will hit Madrid in a positive way. Yeah.
Any other quick comments on that?
Now, the world, I think, will have major issues before it's into the landing station when the sea will rise. So I think we cannot be too much worried about that before we are worried about other more, let me say, human touch things.
Okay, well, with that rising note, let me make two quick housekeeping comments. First of all, we have a coffee and networking break sponsored by our friends at Telecoms, and we'll be back at 11 o'clock for the spotlight on the Nordics. And finally, and first most, please join me for a fantastic panel and great participation by our panelists.